It was the third inmate that week we'd found dead in his cell. Inmate deaths aren't exactly uncommon in a prison setting. Some guys realize this is going to be their life, and they decide to end it. Some people run afoul of a criminal element, and they pay the price. Some people are just placed in a cell with the wrong person, and when they snap hard. Edward Wargrave appeared to be one of the former. He had cut himself from ear to ear, and he died with the most fulfilled look of joy on his face. His cellmate had woken up to discover him like this, face down on his bunk and cold as a block of ice. When we had rolled the doors at 4:30 a.m. for breakfast, he'd been sitting on the top bunk, shaking as his roommate lay in a pool of congealing blood. I was currently standing in the cell with the inspection team, such as it was. Captain Darvin, my shift supervisor, the Inspector General, a beefy man named Halk, the Assistant Warden, Clive, and myself. Clive was acting as the Warden's representative in this matter, and his enthusiasm was a little creepy. Most Assistant Wardens would have hung back and taken notes, but Clive seemed to want to stay close enough to smell the man's last meal. I saw Halk move him out of the way several times so that he and the captain could get a better look at the body. It was Halk's job to do a formal inspection, and the Weasley little man was clearly getting on his nerves. Clive was a new addition to the staff, and no one really seemed to like him. He was thin to the point of emaciation, a fact that was not helped by his height. The man was about 5 feet tall, and even that height was gained on tiptoe sometimes. He had a pinched face and an unfortunate nose that looked more concave than anything. He seemed to delight in any sort of suffering that he could find, and he already had a reputation with the inmates as someone best avoided. I yawned, already ready to be done with this. It was 4:45 in the morning, and I already knew there would be another 3 hours of paperwork for something like this. I had been acting as Security 9, a position directly under the captain, for about 6 months now. It's not a bad gig, mostly a lot of paperwork and running around. You're the captain's right hand in many ways, and you often act as his representative on matters. You're also responsible for making sure that everything runs smoothly on the compound, which can sometimes be a little daunting. After several years of working as an officer, it wasn't too overwhelming a task, and I took to it quickly. The strange deaths didn't start happening until recently. 5 inmates in the last month and a half had been found in their cells. They had all committed suicide, cutting their throats from ear to ear, before dying with the most profound look of happiness on their face. All of them were different, and there was no real pattern to any of them. The first one had been a young guy, only here about 6 months, while Wargrave was a lifer who had been incarcerated for the last 15 years. The other 3 had ran the gambit somewhere in the middle, and there was no gang affiliation or demographic to connect any of them. The warden was keeping it all very hush-hush from the outside world, which was why we were investigating it. Keep it inside the gate was our general MO 90% of the time, especially after the Captain Peterson incident. Halk was talking to Wargrave's cellmate. The little man was beside himself, blubbering and talking very fast about how he had been asleep, and the officer had just seen him an hour ago snoring, so he couldn't have been the one to do this. The kid was all of 22, and doing a short sentence for battery. He did not want to get more time, or get hemmed up over some nonsense, like his cellmate killing himself. As they loaded Wargrave onto the stretcher, his arm flopped out bonelessly. That's how I noticed the new tattoo. The skin around the word Jesse was red and angry looking. Prison tattoos are rarely particularly beautiful, and are a great way to get a nasty case of hepatitis if you're lucky. This one, however, was exceptionally inflamed looking. It almost looked as though someone had branded him, as opposed to just marking his skin with ink. I mentioned it to the inspector, and he nodded, saying they would make a note of it on his chart, since they were supposed to keep track of any new tattoos. Then the stretcher left with Wargrave, and the captain and I returned to the office to start paperwork. I didn't think about the tattoo again until a couple of days later, as I was directing inmates to chow. I was directing D-Dorm towards the chow hall, when we were stopped by a group returning from the chow hall. You didn't want to let them get too close to each other if you could help it. That was usually how drugs got exchanged or people got stabbed. So I stopped them at the corner and let the new group go on ahead, turning left as they headed for their dorm. As I stood there, I noticed a familiar tattoo on the first man's arm and squinted at it. It was fresh, the arm still inflamed looking. It had the same look Wargrave's had. The ink was possessed of an almost burnt look. It looked as though someone had gently branded him with the name Jesse, the name done in cursive. The squiggles supposed to look cute, I supposed. There was nothing cute about the tattoo, though. It looked painful, like it would itch and be very uncomfortable. It seemed that this Jesse would never be far from his mind, or the attention of his dirty fingernails. Inmate, and as he looked up, I realized that I knew this one. Myers, when'd you get that new ink? Myers, a scrawny white boy in his early 30s who had never really lost that look of 16, looked at me almost guiltily. Tattooing in prison is an offense that can get you put in confinement, and failure to give up your artist is just as bad. Of course, tattling on your tattoo artist is a great way to get stabbed, so most choose to go to the box instead. Myers made to cover the tattoo, but seemed to think better of it. I'd seen it, so there was no use pretending it didn't exist. He slumped a little and looked about shiftily before responding. "Just the name of my girl, Sarge." I gave him a mistrustful look. "That's not fresh ink, is it?" He shook his head dumbly, and about that time the line began to move. I let him go, not wanting to hold up chow over a new tattoo, but I made a note of it to check on him later. 2 inmates with the same name on them was a little suspicious. At least, that's what I thought at the time. We concluded chow, getting everyone packed back in, and then I went to the captain's office to start my evening work. Honestly, I would have probably forgotten about the tattoos completely, if it weren't for the paperwork that Captain Darvan dropped on my desk at 9 o'clock that night. He had a haggard look these days. These inmate deaths were really starting to get to him. Brass was on his ass about finding out why so many inmates were committing suicide, and he really wanted to tell them something substantial. "I've got to finish typing up my reports for the Wargrave suicide. Could you go through these and make sure everything looks right? I've been through them so many times that the words are starting to run together. I think a fresh set of eyes might be just what I need." I told him I would, and I pulled the files over. I hadn't really been doing anything anyway, just reviewing count slips and going over our logs to make sure they had been turned in this morning. Going over this busy work would be just what I needed to kill the time until the 11 o'clock count came up, and it was time to count these guys yet again. It wasn't until I had started going through the second file that I noticed something scribbled on the front under defining marks. Someone had written Jesse under tattoos in a thick, blocky script. The location was inmate Cohen's neck, and the word Jesse jumped out at me like a ghost in a funhouse. I switched back to the first file, an inmate named Clark, and looked over defining marks to find that he also had a tattoo that read Jesse. This one had been on his calf, but the coincidence was just too much to overlook. I fumbled through the following 3 files, seeing all 5 inmates with Jesse tattoos on some part of their body. They had all been handwritten, meaning that they were likely fresh ink, and the fact that all of them had been written in seemed to indicate that these were not something they had come to prison with. It was all just a little too weird to overlook as circumstance. I brought it to the captain's attention, but he cut me off and told me to just file the paperwork. I've got enough on my plate without worrying about whatever goddamn thing inmates are getting tattooed on themselves. Just get it done, or I'll find someone else that can and maybe give them your post. Captain Darvan was clearly feeling the squeeze, and I couldn't hold his outburst against him. So I finished the paperwork and told him I'd take it down to the inspector's office and put it in his box. He waved me off and said to hurry back because it would be count time in about 30 minutes. I took the load of files and went to the admin hallway to drop them off. As I left the captain's office, I couldn't help but get a prickle on the nape of my neck as I stood in the shadow of the warden's tower. He had moved his office to that old rat-infested place, and many of us felt like he had taken up residence there. You could see him sometimes on the catwalk as he walked around the tower, just staring at people. It was damn creepy, the warden himself being damn creepy too. This was not something I would have shared with anyone, because you never knew when the warden was watching, or what he might hear. He had been at Stragview for a long, long time, and sometimes firing people wasn't the worst thing he could do. People had disappeared and never been seen again. Some of them had been seen again, and that was almost worse. I hurried across the yard so as not to linger under his supposed sight, and was soon in the admin hallway. I had expected to put the files in the inspector's box that sat on the wall outside his office. To my surprise, though, the light was on and the door was open. Inspector Halk sat at his desk, one big hand resting against his head as he dozed. The last few weeks had been hell for him too. 5 dead inmates, even those dead at their own hands, was hard to explain on paperwork. He was clearly getting the squeeze from someone higher up as well, and not having any luck figuring it out. He jerked awake when I knocked, and told me to come in. I set the files on his desk, telling him they were from Captain Darvin. He thanked me and said he would get right on them. I started to leave right then and there, but I turned on a whim and asked him if he'd noticed the tattoos. He blinked at me and asked me what I was talking about, offering me a seat. I pointed out to him that all 5 inmates had Jesse tattooed on them in a relatively fresh sort of way. They had all been recently marked with that name, and then they had all died. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it seemed a little too convenient to me. Halk raised an eyebrow. You gunning for my job or something? I told him at the moment it didn't look like much fun, and he laughed, telling me to show him what I was talking about. I opened up the case files and showed him the hastily scrawled tattoo descriptions on a few of them. He nodded and said that was weird, but not the weirdest thing he'd ever seen. He thanked me for the information, saying that it did tie them all together somehow. That was when I told him about the inmate I'd seen with a fresh tattoo, and he perked up a bit. Do you mind coming with me to see him? If he has the same tattoo, he might have some information on this. If this isn't one big coincidence, that is. I told him I didn't mind at all, and we set out for D-Dorm to get inmate Myers. We came in through the side door and nodded at the guard in the booth, approaching and telling her quietly that we were here to see inmate Myers. She pointed me to a bunk towards the back, and the other inmates parted as we approached. Like most open bay dorms, D-Dorm is set up like a bunkhouse. There are lots of bunk beds with foot lockers in front of them, and about 150 men sleep across 2 similar sides. Myers was set near the fire door towards the end of the bunkhouse, but his bed was empty when we arrived. I asked some of the others, and one of them told me that he had went to the bathroom. He was acting kind of weird, just suddenly got up and walked to the bathroom like someone in a dream. We beat feet to the bathroom and found Myers sitting on the toilet. He was fully clothed, with his head down and his hands in his lap. I thought for a moment that he might be praying, but he was dead silent and seemed to have taken no notice of us. Myers, the inspector wants a word with you. You aren't in any trouble. He just wants to talk to you about some things. Myers didn't move. Come on, Myers, don't make a scene. I told you you're not in any trouble. The man just... But that's when I put a hand on his shoulder and noticed how still he was. As if from my touch, he fell over. His head hit the tile wall of the bathroom stall, and that was when his throat began to bleed. We were suddenly in a pool of blood, and Myers was staring sightlessly at the opposite wall beneath the urinal. Captain Darvin was less than pleased to get a call about yet another inmate suicide. He was even less pleased to discover Inspector Halk and I were already there. I told you not to go sticking your nose into this, Darvin whispered roughly to me as we stood outside the dorm. I told you just to go deliver files and leave this alone. If you can't follow orders, don't chastise your officer for showing some initiative, Halk rumbled, walking out of the dorm and glowering at Darvin. If he hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have put 2 and 2 together. He deserves a commendation, not a dressing down. Captain Darvin looked a little put out about being spoken to in such a way, but he grunted and stalked away, as Halk and I stood outside the dorm and talked about what would come next. Fortunately, the answer seemed to find us. As we stood making plans outside the dorm, someone tapped on the window and looked out at the 2 of us. It was an inmate, someone I recognized. Sullivan held up an angry red tattoo on his arm as we stared back at him. Like Myers, the tattoo looked more like a burn than fresh ink. Sullivan's eyes told us all we needed to know, and I could see that Halk had come to the same conclusion. The man was scared and was willing to break the code of silence in order to make this fear go away. We took Sullivan down to the inspector's office and told him to tell us all that he knew. He was hesitant at first. They all are, but when their own safety is at stake, they'll usually spill their guts. So, I was asleep about 3 nights ago when my dream was interrupted by this girl. A girl? I asked skeptically. In here? Not precisely. I was having a dream I've had before. The time I robbed the bank that landed me in here. In real life, it had all went south pretty bad, and in the dream, it was going even worse. The cops had machine guns and rocket launchers, and they was blowing us up, and really just making a mess out of it. I was hunkered behind the teller desk, clutching my automatic pistol and just praying to God to make it all go away. Then I look up, and there's this girl standing in front of me. She says if I wanted it all to go away, she could help. She said she can make everything better, and all I have to do is take her hand. I'm guessing she wasn't there on the day in question, Halk asked. If she had been, I guess I wouldn't be doing 25 to life, Sullivan said. "You jokers want to hear the rest of the story, or you want to keep interrupting me?" We both nodded to him to continue, and he went on. "So I take her hands. Why not? It's just a dream after all. And then it felt like my arm was on fire. The flames seemed to creep over my forearm, and I tried to pull them away from her. But her grip was like iron, and she just held me there as her smile got wider and wider. Then she turned my arm over, and I could see the name that was printed there. The name Jessie looked like it had been branded into me, and she said that I belonged to her now. She also said that she'd be back for what was hers later." "Then what happened?" I asked. "I woke up and saw that her name was on me. That's when I realized that it might have been a little more than a dream. That's when Myers approached me, showing me his own markings. He said that Jessie had come to him in a dream as well, saying that she could help him escape his current situation. There were quite a few of them, actually, 8 or 9, but now I guess there might only be a couple of us." I asked him for the names of the ones that were left, but he refused to tell. "You know what happens to snitches in here. They'll have to come forward on their own, but I need your help now. After Myers, I was the first one to get my brand. Everyone before Myers is dead now, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be next. I need help, and I'll gladly say whatever you need me to say so that this Jessie doesn't get me." Halk signed the orders right then and there, and we put him under surveillance. We had him in an isolation cell down in medical, telling them that he was a witness to the murders that had been happening on the compound. Halk put me on duty that first night, watching him and sitting with him, but nothing happened. I watched the second night as well, and the night after that. I came in on my off days to sit with him, and on the 5th day, something finally happened. I was drowsing. 5 days of 12-hour shifts will do that to you, and I had already decided that tomorrow I would let someone else take this for a night or two. It was about 2 a.m. when my chair threatened to spill me over, and I realized I'd been sleeping. I looked up into the small room where we were keeping him, and saw that Sullivan wasn't alone in there. Someone was standing over him, and as they stroked his thinning hair, he shuddered in his sleep. I was speechless for a moment, unsure of what to do. The woman was tall and thin to the point of gauntness. Her long silver hair hung down in front of Sullivan's face. As it touched him, he shuddered violently. Then she bent down and pressed her lips to his ear, whispering to him and telling him something he didn't seem to want to hear. His eyes snapped open suddenly, and the pupils had become black and staring like a doll's eyes. I was up and banging on the glass, asking her just what the hell she thought she was doing in there. She smiled at me, her lips pulled back in a feral grin that made my testicles pull up into my chest. It was a decidedly cannibalistic sort of grin, the sort of grin that hinted she might come after me once she had finished with him. Sullivan had gotten to his feet, looking around the little room as if trying to figure out what to do. There were no weapons here, no bunks to hang yourself from, no ledges to jump from, but he seemed to have found something nonetheless. He lowered his head and began to run at the wall, intent on breaking his neck. I stepped up to the door, pushing the key in the lock and trying to make it open. The key stopped about halfway around though, not wanting to connect and open the door. I bent over the key, trying to make my weight force it open, but the more I pushed, the more the key groaned and threatened to break. I began to panic, not knowing what to do. They would never believe that some ghost woman had broken in and killed Sullivan. They would think that he had decided to kill himself, and I had simply sat here and watched it happen. Then a pair of strong hands encircled mine, taking the keys and pushing me aside. I looked up and realized it was the warden. He was smiling down at me with that slightly serpentine face of his, and as he pushed me against the wall, ever so gently, he told me not to move and just to stand. Then he proceeded into the isolation cell, and I was treated to the sound of Sullivan nearly cracking his skull on the wall as he ran a second time. The woman, I suppose she was Jessie, looked up at him with something like terror mixed with curiosity. I couldn't see what lay in the warden's eyes, since he had his back to me, but she began to back away as he forced her into a corner. Her face still looked as a predator's must when faced with a larger predator, unsure if they can share the food, or if the larger one means to have it all, and them as well. Then, as the warden finally pinned her to the corner, she began to scream, and I placed my hands over either side of my head as I tried to muffle that piercing sound. I could feel it vibrate in my bones, hear it wavering over my senses, and I felt that I must surely shatter if I was forced to endure it for much longer. I slid to the ground, surprised not to feel blood running through my fingers, and put my head between my knees as I prayed for it to end. It seemed my prayers were answered, because the screaming abruptly stopped. I looked up to see the warden towering over me, Sullivan lying on the floor as his head bled and his neck bruised. The warden just smiled, and I became afraid that he would silence me as easily as he had Jesse. I would suggest that you call medical ASAP. It would appear that inmate Sullivan has had a psychotic break and will need some medical attention. I won't tell anyone about your nap on the floor, so long as you don't mention anything about Mr. Sullivan's nighttime visitor. Agreed? I nodded dumbly, and he patted my head, his strange, scaly fingers rasping over my hair. He started walking away then, but stopped suddenly, and left me with one more thing to ponder before returning to his tower. Please tell Inspector Hulk that the situation we spoke of earlier has been taken care of. If there's one thing I can't stand in this world, it's a fucking poacher. Then he left, and I was forced to call medical and get Sullivan some help. Sullivan had nearly cracked his skull, and his neck was badly bruised where he had wrenched it against the wall. He would spend the next few weeks in medical, to be sure, and Hulk sent me home to get some rest. When I told him what the warden had said, privately, of course, he went a little pale and just nodded. He said he didn't want any details. He didn't want to know what had happened. He just told me to go get some sleep. Laying here awake, however, trying to forget what I saw, is a little harder than expected. I watched the warden, a man who signs my checks and commands the respect of nearly every warm body on the compound, kill what I suspect was a restless spirit. The more I try to puzzle it out, the more questions I seem to discover. The longer I lay here, trying to make sense of it all, the more I wonder what will happen to those men marked by Jesse, who still live on the compound. The longer I think about it, the more I think it might be time to take that vacation I've been putting off.
Hey Sarge, can I see you for a minute? I'd taken half a step towards the cell when Officer Marshall stuck a meaty paw out to stop me. Don't engage him. It's best to just ignore that one. I nodded, feeling a little bad for just blowing the guy off as we got back to counting inmates. It was my first day in confinement, and I wanted to make a good impression on the guys I'd be spending a lot of time with in the near future. Corrections was not a job I'd ever seen myself doing, but after college, I didn't have as many prospects as I'd thought I would. I could go work at the diner, I could go work at the hardware store, I could go work as a laborer at one of the local farms, or I could pick up and move somewhere with better job prospects. I wasn't really opposed to leaving Kashmir. It was a small town without a lot going for it, but I wasn't in a place where I could afford to leave at the moment. I started looking for jobs in other cities, and that's when I stumbled across a posting for Stragview. After looking at the pay range, I started making a plan. With the sign-on bonus and pay grade, I could work here for the next 2 to 3 years and have enough money saved up to move myself across the state, set myself up in a job that actually interested me. What's more, the security certification I got from training would look good in my portfolio and maybe open up my prospects with employers. So I signed up, took the 90-day training certification, and started my 2-year tour at Stragview Penitentiary. After a few shifts of coming into work on time and not being a totally worthless human being, my captain asked if I wanted to try my hand at confinement. He said he had a lot of brutes and manhandlers, but not a lot of people willing to have a conversation with an inmate. Maybe talk them out of some dumb stuff. His last one had apparently gone home and murdered his whole family before winding up here for execution, and he mostly had brutes back there after that. You and Marshall can good cop, bad cop these guys a little, and maybe I won't have to fill out so much use of force paperwork on some dumbass from G-Dorm. I'd agreed, and here I was, in the show, as they called it. We finished counting the 3 quads, and when we got back to the station, the grizzled old sergeant went for a smoke. "Keep an eye on 2, he mumbled, patting Marshall on the arm as he left. I'd taken a seat in one of the ancient old chairs they kept there, Marshall sitting behind the bank of cameras that made up our new surveillance post, before he turned to look at me. He steepled his fingers, trying to choose his words very carefully, and I immediately got a little nervous. I had been told that Marshall was a little ornery, a little hard to get along with, but he seemed fine to me. The two of us had talked about strategy games and fantasy novels. Marshall was a big Salvatore fan, as big as I was, and when we'd called count, he'd gone out to the floor like we'd done it 1,000 times before. I'm only going to say this once, but I want you to listen. I'm not trying to tell you your business. I'm not trying to scare you, but I don't want you to get hurt. The inmate in G101 is best avoided at all costs. I nodded, but internally I breathed a sigh of relief. He was just talking about the guy I'd started to talk to. Guy was probably a lifer or someone who liked to mess with the new guys. I'd seen a story in training about downing the duck, and I figured it was in the same vein as that. Once he talked to you, you were probably hooked, and eventually he'd reel you in. That's inmate, I tried to remember his name, but Marshall beat me to it. James Tiberius Babicus. He spoke the name like an incantation against evil. He's been a resident of G1 for the last year and a half, and for the last year and 2 months, I've tried to get him sent elsewhere. The man's a menace, a manipulator. He will waste your time at any given opportunity. It's best to just leave him be. Don't speak to him. Don't acknowledge him. What about showers, I asked, not sure that we could ignore him and still give him the things he was supposed to have. He doesn't get them. We open his flap, and only if he moves to the back of the cell. A towel and a bar of soap go in. He bird baths, or he smells. He has only himself to smell good for, anyway. Is he housed alone, I asked, still curious about this strange inmate that had Marshall so spooked. He is, he confirmed, but that's what happens when you're responsible for the deaths of 2 cellmates and an officer. He killed an officer? I asked, startled since the man I'd seen looking through the glass hadn't looked like much. Not here, surely, or he'd be somewhere else. Marshall shook his head, glancing at the cameras before looking out into the shadowy depths of Quad 2 for a second. He killed 3 men in that cell. One of them when he first got here, another 5 months later, and an officer 5 months after that. That's why I'm telling you this. I want you prepared for this man when he comes to talk to you. He is never to be by the door when you open that flap. He is always to be at the back of the cell, facing away from the door, or he gets nothing. He doesn't eat, he doesn't get fresh clothes, he doesn't get anything unless he's facing away from you. Once the things he is required to have go into his cell, you close the flap and walk away. Got it? He smiled as he finished, and I believed him when he said that he wasn't joking or this wasn't some kind of weird hazing. I told him I had it, and as Sergeant walked back in, smelling of cigarettes, we went to start showers for the evening. That began my time around inmate Babicus. He was a weird guy, kind of small and quiet for the most part. His parentage was difficult to pin down. He looked mixed race, but which races had mixed was anybody's guess. Marshall just shrugged when I asked him. About once a shift, he would try to get my attention, but it was only when Marshall wasn't around. Marshall was a big guy, probably in his early to mid-40s, who had hands and arms like a longshoreman. Sometimes he would glower at Babicus, and the inmate would smile and give him this ain't we old pals look. He never spoke to him, and the inmate's food always came in a brown bag so we could drop it in and close it up before the inmate could leave the back of the cell. True to his word, Babicus never showered, never saw a medical, never received meds, never got so much as a letter from anyone. Not because we withheld these things from him, but because no one wanted to have anything to do with him. He was utterly forgotten, a black spot in the dorm, and no one seemed to want to speak with him, inmates or staff. I felt a little bad for him in the beginning, but after night of dealing with him, I became less sympathetic. You see, inmate Babicus wanted nothing so much as your attention, and he wasn't picky about how he got it. Every round, he would try some gamble to get you to acknowledge him. He would try charm. Hey, Sarge, I bet you got something tasty in your lunch bag. If you don't, you can have a soup of mine or something. I got a few out he tried to interest you in things you might have in common. Hey, Sarge, you catch a game last night? Who won? I remember the Ravens were really getting their asses kicked in the... He would try insults. Yeah, move along, pussy. I don't want to talk to you no ways. I can tell you a weak shit by the... He would claim medical assistance. Officer, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I need a nurse. I need to go to the hospital. Help me. Somebody help me. Sometimes he would try to move you by beginning to wail and beg for help. Sarge, I need someone to talk to for a minute. I'm thinking dark thoughts. I'm feeling so low. I just need someone to talk to for... But no matter what, we would ignore him and keep doing what we were doing. He never pursued any of this. He never hurt himself, and if you called medical for his emergencies, they would say that he was fine and refuse to come down. Everyone you talked to about inmate Babicus seemed to have the same opinion of him, and it was a universal thing that no one liked him or would interact with him. He was an enigma, but he was a mystery I was usually too busy to worry about. Until they started taking Marshall out of confinement, that was. It happened at briefing about 6 months after I started there. We were getting ready to head to our dorms when we were informed that Marshall was going to work as Security 9 that night. Security 9 is the front man for the captain, the power behind the throne, and is usually the one who settles issues in the dorm so the captain doesn't have to. They gave me and Sarge some new guy, Perkins, and I was told to train him up and get him ready for the show. Marshall said it would probably just be temporary, and I went to go train Perkins so he'd be a useful replacement. 4 months later, Perkins had become 40, had become vets, had finally become an officer we'd received from another facility named Adams. At this time, Sarge had been replaced by a useless Sarge named Belford. We'd come in one evening to hear that Sergeant Thomas, had been hospitalized after a bad heart attack. They weren't sure he was going to come back, despite his insistence that he needed to return to his post, and Belford had been elected to replace him as our confinement sergeant. Belford greeted Adams and I, shaking our hands and telling us it was a pleasure to work with us, but he turned out to be useless. Marshall had told me ahead of time, strictly off to the side, that he would be a poor replacement for Sarge, but I didn't believe him right away. Marshall was a good guy. We'd become very good friends over the past few months, but he could be a bit of a pessimist. He's lazy, unmotivated, and he will not do paperwork or rounds. Worse, when he tries to do paperwork, he messes it up worse than if he just didn't do it at all. Adams is lazy too, but at least he can be counted on to finish showers and help with chow. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, buddy, but you're basically the confinement sergeant now. You will hate it. You will likely dream of quitting, but stick it out. In the end, I think your efforts may be rewarded. That began the worst 3 months of my life. Bedford was every bit as bad as Marshall had warned. Very few of the COs on my shift were the picture of health, but Bedford made the others look good by comparison. He would not do rounds. He would not deal with inmates unless forced, and when he did, he would simply give them whatever they wanted so he could return to his bubble. What he did do was book inmates into confinement, ruin perfectly good paperwork, and watch YouTube all night, as he elevated the stock price of Hot Pockets, 1 box at a time. After a month, I told him to stop doing folders, and I would do them when I got done with showers. He was happy to oblige, and every night after that, he happily sprayed crumbs across the keyboard as he consumed carbs and cat videos in equal parts. I sighed in disgust, my pants and shirt sweaty from moving grown men between showers and cells for the first 4 hours of my shift, as I turned back to the folders that were the lifeblood of the unit. Sometimes I would manage to kick the chair Adams was sleeping in hard enough to wake him up for a round. Sometimes I'd just do it myself. But ultimately, the work got done, and I persevered. It was month 13 for me of my 24-month plan, a plan I suspected would stretch on for another year because I had given up on rejoining normal society. That was when the mystery of inmate Babicus was finally solved. It was a mystery that would be solved with pain and tears in the end. Through all of this, inmate Babicus had not changed at all. He continued to harass every guard who walked past him, but all of them knew better than to interact with him. I had warned all the new ones, but Adam seemed to have nothing for him from the start. He would spit and cuss and kick all he wanted, but he was ignored, and he continued to fester in the cell like a mushroom in the shower stall. He still tried, though on the day in question, he finally got a reaction out of me. It had been the day from hell. 2 inmates had flooded their cells, making showers take way longer than they should have. Day shift hadn't finished the medical visits, so a nurse showed up at 10 to get us to pull some inmates for night meds. The night shift that had been here the night before, D shift, had messed up the folders by entrusting them to a new bubble officer, so I spent most of the night fixing them. I had to do incident reports for the 2 inmates who flooded, since we had to use force on them to get them to stop, and when round time came at 4, I still wasn't halfway through the folders. I looked over to Adams, but realized he was already gone. A glance through the window showed me he was out on the floor with the nurse doing morning med pass, and they were still in quad 4, which meant they had just started. I looked at Bedford, the big lummox pounding the desk as a cat did something stupid while a person voiced it over, and shook my head as I went to do a round. I started in 1, and that was when it happened. You see, on top of all that, inmate Babacus had tried to bother me every time I went past his cell that night. He had exhausted all gambits and taken to insulting me more than anything. I was a pussy. I was a cracker. I was a homophobic slur that I won't use here. I performed sex acts with various members of my own species and other species, and on and on and on and on. I had ground my teeth every time I heard his voice, until I was pretty sure that my left bottom molar was about to crack. But I'd be lying if I said that was all it was. Babacus had been repeating this process every night for as long as I could remember, and by now it was like a constant ice flow eroding a stone. My patience, my mental health, my will to live, it was all in tatters, and I was worried that someday I might hurt him, more than I was worried about him hurting me. It's hard to explain, but after a while the darkness starts creeping up on you, and all the hopelessness and negativity turns you into the very thing you hate. No matter how much you fight it, eventually it gets its claws in you, and that night, it got me. I was coming around his cell when a small voice snapped the minor threads of my sanity like piano wire. "Sarge, can I talk to you for a minute?" When his voice hit me, I lost it. "What, Babacus?" I shouted, turning my full attention to the cell door for the first time. "What the hell do you want?" It was dark, but I could see his eyes as he peeked at me through the thin sheet of plexiglass. When he smiled, his teeth looked very white in the dark space, but I was too lost to rage to care. He had wanted my attention. Well, now he had it. "I just wanted to know what your plans were for after work." I opened my mouth to tell him it was none of his damn business what I meant to do. But instead, I told him the truth. And as the anger drained out of me in slow spurts, I felt a sense of intense malaise wash over me. I'm gonna sleep until it's time to come back to work again. I might stop for some food, too. "That's good. Man, when I was on the outside, I used to love to make weird stuff with gas station food. I'd go buy ramen noodles and canned cheese and He just kept talking, kept laying out his recipe for something that sounded terrible, but I couldn't turn away. I found myself getting closer to the door, stepping right up next to stare at the grate as I listened, and as he went on, I could smell his rancid breath through the little holes. I tried to pull against it. I didn't want to waste my time with him, but the longer I listened, the more I was drawn in. "You got any coffee up there, Sarge? I bet you drink it with cream and sugar. My mom and I used to sit on the back porch and drink coffee and watch the sun come up. She was the only person who ever actually talked with me. Everyone else just ignores me or they die, but Mom always seemed to enjoy hearing me talk. I guess she died too, but not 'cause of nothing I did. She was just old, and one day she says, 'James, I won't be around forever, so you better—'" My teeth chattered a little, my legs shaking as I stood listening to his story. What was happening to me? I felt pulled towards the grate, his words drawing me in, and the longer I listened, the weaker I felt. Someone was saying something over the radio, but anything not coming out of this man's mouth was tuned down to background noise. I felt like I might be getting sleepy, like I might be getting ready to pass out, but Babacus was only getting started. The longer he talked, the more sturdy his voice became. The more I listened, the less weak he sounded, the more he sounded like he was growing. How tall was the man? He hadn't appeared very large, but the more he spoke, the more it seemed like his voice was rising up the door frame. When she died, I just didn't know what to do with myself, Sarge. I was so sad, I had started making my own way. I was like a child by myself, and all I knew was talking. I started talking to people, telling my story, and then they just kept dying. At first it was weird, just watching them shrivel up the longer they listened, but pretty soon I figured out it was me doing it. I was taking something from them, something I had never been able to take before. You see, when I was a kid, I was real shy. I only really talked to my mom and clammed up otherwise. I remember once a teacher tried to get me to talk in front of the class, but the words fell from his mouth like diarrhea, and the phrase had never been more apt to me. He was rambling, spewing his words like a fire hose, and the longer I listened, the weaker I felt. This was how he killed people, I thought, as his rambling went on and on. He talked them to death and stole their life. Pretty soon, he'll do the same to me, I thought, and I tried to break away so that I could get out of the vacuum. I pushed with all my might, trying to snap out of my trance, but I was in too deep. I could hear someone yelling, hear inmates kicking and screaming, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there and listen to this fool babble. When someone hit me in a football tackle, I gasped in pain as my hip impacted the stairs. I broke my hip in 3 places, and it likely saved my life. Marshall had hit me around the waist, and when he stood up, he started shouting at the quad for all of them to shut up. He very carefully avoided speaking to Babacus, but I could see him give Marshall the same knowing grin that he had fixed on him before. Marshall called medical down, and I was loaded onto an ambulance and taken to Kashmir Medical Center. It's all kind of a blur after the EMTs gave me a shot of something, but when I came back to myself, I was in a crisp, clean hospital room, with Marshall sitting across from me in an oversized chair, the ones they always leave for guests. "Good. I was afraid I was too late," he said, breathing a sigh of relief. "Too late?" I asked, and I almost flinched at how brittle my voice sounded. "Belford called to tell me that you needed assistance in G. Stat, but the stupid fool didn't bother to give any details. The story is that you tripped going down the stairs and hurt yourself. The camera footage will likely go missing, and the prison will pay for your medical bills and put you on workman's comp." I nodded, wincing as my hip throbbed painfully. "Marshall, what the hell happened out there?" "What happened is you engaged inmate Babacus in conversation and discovered why no one else will. It's hard to understand if you've never seen it in action, but now you know better." Marshall flexed his fingers for a moment, trying to find the words to convey what I was really asking, and finally decided to just push ahead. "About a year before you started, I made the same mistake. I knew better. I'd been told better, but Babacus is crafty. He picks and picks and picks until you just can't take it anymore. That night he finally got under my skin. I had an inmate in the quad kicking his door and threatening to hurt himself, and the captain we had made Belford look like a super cop. He refused to come down and deal with it, telling us to handle it, and Babacus happened to be his neighbor. I'd answered him honestly, thinking it was the guy in the cell that I'd been dealing with, and before I knew it, he had me. I stood there and listened to his nonsense, feeling my energy get sapped away as he talked. He had me for about 3 minutes before Sarge noticed what was happening. My fellow floor officer was at the captain's office, He was useless and was out flirting with the girl who did all the paperwork for our useless captain, and Sarge popped the emergency keys and ran to save me. He dragged me off the floor and pulled me back to the station, but the damage was done. Marshall looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw pain behind his eyes as he asked his next question. "How old do you think I am?" I shook my head. "I don't know, 40, 43 tops." He smiled, but there was no joy behind it. "I'll be 25 this year. I'm only 3 years younger than you. This is what Babacus does to you. He sucks the life out of you to feed his own sick needs. But not anymore. The warden says he's going somewhere special, somewhere he can't ever do this again. We can rest easy, knowing you'll be the last. At least I hope so." He left after that, saying he had to get some sleep before work tonight. I look at myself now and understand what Marshall meant. I've aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, and I wonder if the change is purely to my appearance. Did he take those years from me? How did he manage to do this with only words? Did the warden know that this was something he was capable of? It seems as if he must have, but then why would he give him the opportunity to do it again? The longer I sit here contemplating it, the more I question what other monsters might lay within Stragview, and whether I want to go back there and face them a second time. I'll never forget Davis, and what he ultimately taught me about myself. I haven't always been a great person, and it's probably what brought me to Stragview in the first place. I could say my parents never taught me right from wrong, but that's a cop-out. I could say I fell in with a bad crowd, but a lot of the guys I brought down with me were just following my example. At the end of the day, I was just looking for a way to put myself in a box, and I finally found it. I was 23 and particularly wild. I'd already done one stint in prison, just 18 months, but it introduced me to the kind of guys who could give me an education that would give me more time in that particular school of learning. I was still hanging with them when I got out, running some drugs, stealing some cars, and generally being a nuisance. I got a little overzealous with one of my usual buyers, a black fella that I didn't know very well, and beat him nearly to death. The judge wanted to make it out like it was a racial thing, but in reality, he had just said the right thing at the wrong time. He had been insinuating that if I had a sister, I should introduce him without taking into account the lightning bolts on the back of my hands, or the gang tattoos up and down my arms. He may not have seen them, but the judge took one look at them and decided that 10 years for assault sounded just about right. I knew that with good behavior, I'd be out in 8 years, so I settled into E-dorm for what I hoped would be the quickest near decade of my life. Davis had the bunk next to mine. He smiled at me when I put my mat down, offered me a cookie out of a pack that he'd been munching on. One look at the guy told me he probably wasn't all there. I'd known guys like him on the street, the kind of guy who maybe isn't playing with a full deck, and I thanked him as I took one of the oatmeal cream cookies from the little plastic tray. He was nice enough, a rarity in prison. Pretty soon we were eating meals together, working out in the yard together, and just generally palling around. Mentally, he was probably about 12, but I'd never really grown up past 12 myself, so we had a lot to talk about. Davis liked cars, comic books, and candy, and I liked a lot of those things too. So for several months, we just kind of hung out, and he became my first real friend on the inside. I didn't notice right away, but there was something odd about Davis. Davis disappeared sometimes. It was never anything you could set your watch or warrant by, but sometimes I would wake up at night and Davis would just be gone. I noticed first at the end of my 7th day. I'd woken up in the middle of the night, really needing the toilet, and I got up and dropped off the bladder buster I was nursing. I had gotten up, gone to the bathroom, and come all the way back to my bunk before I realized that Davis wasn't there. His bunk was empty, and the blankets were rocked up like there might be somebody in them. He'd gotten up in a hurry, it seemed, which was weird for Davis because he habitually made his bed any time he wasn't going to be in it. When I say habitually, I mean almost religiously so. If Davis got up for anything other than to open his footlocker, his bed was always made. So to see it like this now made me wonder. I lay in my rack, shamming sleep as the guard walked by, and waiting for Davis to return from wherever he was. I didn't think anything of it. Nobody went anywhere inside Stragview without somebody with a badge knowing where you were. He'd probably gone to the bathroom. Prison food tends to agree with people about as well as prison does, and I had probably just missed him at the toilet. He could also be helping the guards fold laundry in the little room off the station. I think most of the screws considered him harmless, even though he had smothered his younger brother to death with a pillow about 10 years ago. They knew there wasn't a lot of harm in Davis, so they let him help with things they didn't necessarily want to do. Worst case scenario, he'd been taken to medical for some reason and would probably be back before breakfast. As I lay there waiting for him to come back, I must have been a little tireder than I thought. Before I knew it, I was being shaken awake by the man in question as he told me it was time to get ready for chow. I got dressed and went to line up with him. Shuffling around, it made me remember why I'd been sitting up in the first place. "Hey, did you go somewhere last night?" "Who, me?" Davis asked. He said it with his usual dopey candor, but I didn't think I believed him. "Nah, the other 5'6" asshole who sleeps in the next bed over. Yeah, you." "I didn't go anywhere last night. Slept like a baby. You must be dreaming, Rudy." Rudy was what he called me for some reason, and it was common knowledge that he was the only one who was allowed to call me that. I didn't press it, but the way he said it made me not really believe his story. Davis had never lied to me before. I wasn't sure he was capable of it, but I felt pretty certain that he had just told me a whopper. I didn't know why at the time, but I figured I'd let him keep his secret. Davis didn't strike me as the kind of guy to find romance behind bars, but he'd been here for a decade, so I suppose that anything was possible. If he had stepped off to have himself a little night nudge, then that was no business of mine. I wasn't one of those gang-affiliated guys who would push your face in just because you get your fun on the wrong side of the sheets, and I assumed that when Davis felt comfortable, he'd tell me about it. I kept a close eye on him after that, though, and began to notice that Davis disappeared more than I had noticed. I had GED classes on Tuesday and Thursday, but when one of them had gotten out early, I came back to find that Davis was nowhere to be found. I worked in laundry sometimes, but when the big old industrial dryer broke and they sent us back early one day, I again noticed that Davis was nowhere to be found. When I asked around, no one seemed to know where he was either. Davis was kind of a big guy, soft-bodied and bald-headed, kind of looked like Uncle Fester on a good mood, and the idea that he could hide in plain sight in a dorm of less than 100 people was outrageous. It wasn't just during the daytime either. Sometimes I'd wake up at night and find Davis wasn't in his bunk. Again, I thought he might have a little boyfriend or something, but one time after checking the dorm, I realized he wasn't anywhere. Davis, it seemed, was just kind of gone, and I had no clue where he'd gotten off to. After 3 months of living in the dorm, I decided I needed to find answers. One night, as I lay pretending to sleep after lights out, I heard Davis slip quietly out of bed and open his footlocker. He rifled through the things inside and must have found what he was after pretty quick. He closed it back, and I could almost hear him crouch down a little as he started making his way towards the far end of the dorm. I gave him a little head start, no more than about 5 seconds, and rolled quietly out of my bunk. I looked over at the officer station, seeing only one of them up there and fully immersed in a book at that, and I went in the direction that I'd heard Davis going. The room was a mass of snoring forms and sleeping bodies, but I felt sure that Davis was heading for the area towards the back. There were a pair of bunk beds back there, a pair of bunk beds that had become rusted out and were no longer used. The guards kept talking about having them removed, but they had those big old concrete screws in them that were damn near impossible to get out once you put them in. It was where people sometimes went to smoke or gamble or settle fights because it was easy to wall off with blankets or a couple of guys standing close together. I thought I saw him back there for a second, but as I got close, I realized it was just a blanket that someone had put up to cover the entrance of the bunk. I pulled it aside, expecting to see him in the embrace of a lover or something, but there was no one there. The whole bunk was completely empty. Not a trace of anyone. Somebody whispered at me angrily, telling me to get back to my rack after lights out, and I went back willingly enough. I must have been mistaken about where he was going. I did, however, decide that I was going to wait up for him and have him tell me what was going on. A man was entitled to a secret or two, but this mystery was just too juicy not to get the answer to. I lay there under my blankets, wide awake and pretending to sleep any time a guard walked his path. I was not going to fall asleep this time and ruin my chances of figuring out where my buddy was going. Worst case scenario, I thought, I'd find out he was holding someone's pocket, as the others like to joke. It could be quite a bit worse than that, I further supposed, but Davis wasn't the type to gamble or indulge in any of the more dangerous drugs that floated around the prison. He was a good Christian who didn't believe in gambling, and it often got him into fights when he said as much to the people who did. He didn't believe in drugs either, but that's because his mother had been so down on them. So, if it wasn't some sort of debauchery, then I wasn't sure what Davis had gotten up to. At about 4:30 in the morning, I got my answer. He came skulking back to his bunk, a little out of breath, but looking happy. He had no more opened his locker than I rolled over and sat up, keeping my voice low so that I didn't wake anybody else up. I was worried it would all be for nothing when he nearly screamed, but he gave me a look before wiping his brow and sighing like a cartoon character. "Oh, it's just you, Rudy. I swear you like to give me a heart attack." "You're one to talk," I whispered. "I wake up and roll over and my bunkmate is nowhere to be seen. Where'd you get off to, Davis? Got yourself a little boyfriend or something?" Davis laughed as he climbed back into bed, but he looked unsure as well. He looked like a kid who's gotten caught sneaking cookies from the jar, and now he's got an answer for it. He tried to push it off, telling me he was in the bathroom or that it was nothing to worry about. But I pressed him on it. I was really curious to know what was going on with my buddy, and I told him I wasn't going to leave it alone until I got an answer. We must have gotten a little louder than I thought we had, because one of the guards walked by and told us to be quiet during lights out. As we settled back down, Davis whispered that he would tell me tomorrow. "Meet me at the picnic table when we go to rec. I'll tell you everything, though you might not believe me." He wouldn't say anything till then, no matter how much I pleaded with him. We had breakfast, watched some TV in the day room, and all the while, he refused to say anything about it. The whole time, his response was always that we would discuss it later in a less public place. I was a little concerned about what he had to tell me, especially with all the privacy he was talking about. And when the guards called for rec, the 20 or so other guys lined up with us, and Davis looked like he was preparing to be led into the gas chamber. He kept his hands in his pockets as we walked, and when we finally got to the rec yard, he nodded to the farthest away set of tables and told me to go have a seat. "Okay, what I'm about to show you is a complete secret. You can't tell anybody, okay? Like, not a soul. It could get me in a lot of trouble, and I don't want to be in trouble." I nodded, telling him that I wouldn't tell anyone. He looked around, holding his hands out to reveal a piece of white chalk. I bunched up my eyebrows. Chalk? I've seen chalk before, Davis. Not like this, you hadn't, Davis insisted. This is magic chalk. I must have looked dubious, so Davis pushed on. I found it in the laundry room, the one they let me fold clothes in sometimes, and when I used it on the sidewalk, I was in for a shock. I drew a circle, and suddenly I could see into something a little different than the concrete. When I was little, I had a book with a picture of a little boy looking through a window of a ship, the round windows, I mean. It was like that. I was looking into a world made of cotton candy, with little cotton candy people running around. I thought I might be losing it, but when they turned and looked at me, I knew it wasn't so. I smudged it when someone walked by, and since then I've been using it to travel places. Travel places? I said, suddenly very interested. I'd been in Stragview less than a year, but the idea of traveling to anywhere that wasn't here was very appealing nonetheless. Yeah, Davis said, like make-believe places, fantasy worlds, cartoon places, weird spots that are kind of scary sometimes. Other places maybe I haven't been to yet. I don't usually go back to the same place twice, but sometimes it's nice to just be somewhere, except in prison. I'll never get to leave, the judge saw to that, but I can see the make-believe places, and that's okay, I guess. I wasn't sure I believed him. The guy was a little off, and definitely not playing with a full deck, and he must have seen that on my face. I'll prove it to you, he said, and took me by the arm and led me behind the equipment shed. The equipment shed was behind the rec yard office, and it was a nice shadowy alcove that we probably weren't supposed to be in. Davis took the chalk and drew a circle on the back wall of the office, and as I watched it take shape, I could already see something going on inside. There was an idyllic farm scene, something from an old Mickey Mouse cartoon, and the little Technicolor animals were jumping around and singing and generally being adorable. They looked up as we looked in, and a couple of them waved at us as they came by. I blinked and leaned in, not understanding if this was a trick or something. If it was a trick, it was a good one, and I couldn't find any way that he could be doing this with just a piece of chalk. Can we... I wet my lips as if afraid to ask. Can we go there? We can, Davis said, but not right now. Time works the same way there as it does here, and if we go there and we aren't back for count, then we'll get in trouble and come back to find ourselves in a real world of crap. He took his sleeve and scuffed the picture so that no one would see it, and as the yard sergeant bellowed for us to line up, I had about 1,000,000 questions I wanted to ask. So why would you bother coming back here if you could go there? Davis smiled, apparently glad to have someone to share the secret with. Where would I go? This is my punishment, but I don't think anyone would mind if I took a break every now and again. I laughed, maybe a little condescendingly. But Davis, you don't have to stay here if you can get out with that piece of chalk. You can be free to go wherever you want. Davis looked a little unsure, and maybe even a little guilty. Just 'cause I can get away doesn't mean that I should. I did a bad thing, Rudy. I did something that I can never take back, and if I expect Jesus to forgive me, then I need to do my time and take my punishment. I think he knows that. I think that's why he gave me the chalk. He knows I'm real sorry for what I've done, and decided to give me a little vacation every now and again. The rest of the day was spent asking him about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. It seemed like the chalk could take him anywhere, and I mean anywhere. Davis said he had been to fantastic fantasy world, sci-fi space planets, weird cartoon worlds, and everything in between. He'd done some pretty amazing things and gone on some pretty incredible adventures, but he was always careful not to stay for too long so that he wouldn't be missed. If he was missed, then they might search his bunk. If they searched his bunk, then they'd find the chalk, and that would be the end of that. I try not to use it very often anyway, otherwise I'd use it up, and once it's gone, I don't know if I'll ever find it anymore. It was almost time for lights out when I plucked up my courage and asked him the question I'd really been thinking about. If you can go through that circle to other places, then can other people go too? Davis shrugged. He had clearly never tried. Would you mind if I went with you next time? Davis thought about it and finally agreed. He said, however, that there were rules that I would have to follow if I wanted to go with him. When I say it's time to go, then it's time to go. If we get back late, we'll get in trouble. Then the jig's up. Be careful with what you do, 'cause the things in these other worlds can hurt you, and you can hurt them. Don't bring anything back with you, 'cause it might get you in trouble if they find it. Lastly, don't try staying there after I leave, 'cause that could be real bad. I don't know if I could find you again if you got lost, and I'm not sure you wouldn't just stop existing after I left. I agreed, not really knowing what I was agreeing to when I did, and that night we decided to give it a try. After lights out, we snuck out of our racks and went to the abandoned spot towards the back of the dorm. Davis took out his chalk, and as I played lookout, he drew a circle and told me to come on. As we stepped inside, I became aware that not only could I pass inside that thing, but that he had been right about it being real. We stepped into a Technicolor cartoon world full of dancing animals and singing flowers. The whole thing looked like a drug trip, and as I looked on in astonishment, he took me by the arm and pulled me in. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen, and we spent the next 3 hours just kind of exploring. We were always careful to stay where we could see the portal, not sure if drawing a different one would bring us out somewhere else. We ate some of the fruit we found there and talked to some of the animals, played some games, and generally had fun. When Davis said it was time to go, I started to argue with him, but remembered the rules and bid farewell to my new friends. We came back in just as the lights were coming on, and that was how we ended our first trip together. After that, we traveled about once or twice a month. I wanted to go more, but Davis said that the chalk needed to be saved for special occasions. If we used it too much, we would run out. If we used it too often, the guards might start to notice when we were gone, and then they would take the chalk once they found it. He suspected that some of them might know what it could do, and if they discovered that he had it, he could be in a lot of trouble. Either way, he told me he could only use it twice a month, and that was that. In most things, David was very placid, downright mousy, but in the matter of the chalk, he was very serious. He seemed to understand that he had something special here, and he didn't want to lose it until he absolutely had to. It makes me feel downright bad to think about it now, given how it would all end. It still mystifies me that Davis would choose to stay in prison when he had a means of escape. I knew personally that if I had some kind of way to get out, I'd never come back. We were sitting in one of those weird fantasy worlds, eating apples about the size of your head, when I brought it up to him and asked him very leading questions that I was hoping would make him want to stay in a place like this. Davis was a good friend, maybe one of the best friends I'd ever had, all told, but every time we traveled, it was a little harder for me to want to come back. I had what my grandpa would have called the itch, and the desire to scratch it was nearly insatiable. I still don't understand why you don't just leave, I asked him. Davis swallowed his bite of apple and looked at me funny. 'Cause the judge told me I had a life sentence for killing my brother. I can't leave. Wouldn't be right. Yeah, but I don't think magic chalk figured into his equation when he was passing down that sentence, buddy. You don't have to stay in prison. You've been handed a golden opportunity. I just don't see why you don't take it. I would. Davis got a funny look on his face. He took another bite and chewed before he answered. Maybe that's the difference between you and me, Rudy. I acted in haste and regretted it ever since. I can't say I was young and didn't know any better. I was 17. I knew very well what would happen if I put that pillow over his face. I could blame my mental disability. The lawyer sure wanted to, but that's just a cop-out. My parents had taught me right and wrong, and God knew I'd been to church enough to know what murder was and that it was wrong. I simply couldn't stand playing second fiddle to that squalling little baby anymore, and now I have to pay for that. It's unlikely I'll ever see the kingdom of heaven, but my only chance is to try and atone for what I've done, and hope the good Lord has forgived me when it's my time. We talked about it a little more, but it all came back to the fact that Davis wasn't going to escape with his conscience uncleared. When I asked him why I couldn't escape, he seemed even more afraid. If you stayed here and something happened to you, then God'd be even angrier at me. What if I left you and something killed you? What if I left you and everything just went away? I can't risk that, and I like you a lot, Rudy. I don't want anything to happen to you on general principle. You're a good friend, and the only one I've ever felt comfortable sharing this with. I should have left it alone after that, but I didn't. We argued about it for a little while longer, our debate becoming a full-fledged shouting match. It ended when Davis grabbed me by the arm and said we were leaving. I tried to pull away from him, but the kid was stronger than I thought. He drugged me with an iron grip, and when he shoved me through the multicolored portal, I stumbled back into the quad, ready to jump back through. He was already wiping it away with a blanket, though, putting the chalk in his pocket and glowering at me. I don't want to hear about it any more, he said quietly, as people began to stir around us. You agreed to follow the rules, and if you can't, then you aren't going anywhere anymore. I watched him stomp back to his bunk, realizing that my traveling days might be over. Unfortunately for Davis, the itch refused to go unscratched. Davis didn't ask me to travel after that. To his credit, he didn't travel after that either. He just sat there solidly, shooting me dark looks for the next couple of weeks, as if all this was my fault. I'd only suggested that maybe we not come back to a place full of people who might actively try to kill us. What a bastard I was. It didn't stop me from asking about it, and that seemed to sour his mood even more. Whenever I would make little hints about it, maybe we should travel, or maybe we should go somewhere, he would always change the subject, or just pretend he hadn't heard me. He wasn't mad enough to stop being my friend, though. Davis didn't really have any friends, besides me, but he refused to share that part with me anymore, and it led me to get a little desperate. While I was asking him if we could travel, there was a monster inside of me that was roaring to be let out. I'd used drugs and alcohol for most of my life, but this was an addiction that was worse than any of the rest. I found myself unable to eat more than a little, unable to sleep more than a little, and constantly anxious whenever I was still. Davis refused to budge, however, even in the sight of my anxiety, and that's when I started formulating my plan. I think Davis suspected that I meant to steal the chalk, and to his credit, he was right. If I could get the chalk, I could travel myself. I wouldn't need Davis as long as I had the chalk, and I could just go and never come back. Hell, I'd gladly drop the chalk off and just take whatever was in the circle when I made it. He started taking the chalk with him in the front pocket of his uniform. It was never out of his sight, and I decided to formulate a little plan on how I would get it from him. Any thoughts of taking it by violence was right out, especially after he had so easily dragged me back to the prison. I thought about getting some help, but who would believe me? Stragview was a strange and wondrous place sometimes, but nobody would believe that a half-wit like Davis had a magic chalk that could get you to somewhere fantastical with just a circle. No, if I did this, I'd have to do it on my own, and I'd finally figured out how. I knew a man in the dorm who would sell you pills at a high price. I didn't have anyone to give me commissary. Most of my people on the outside wouldn't even return my letters, but I'd done enough odd jobs for people and done well enough at gambling enough times to get myself a little stash of tradables. When I told him what I wanted, he lifted an eyebrow at me and asked what I meant to do with it. When I told him I just wanted to be able to sleep because I hadn't been sleeping well lately, he nodded and sold me 4 small round pills that I really hoped were as advertised. I didn't even ask what they were called, only wanted them for what they could do. I crushed up all 4 of them and put them in a can of lemonade. Davis loved lemonade, especially the Minute Maid stuff they sold at the commissary. I knew he would take it. I knew he would drink it, and once he was out, I could take the chalk and be gone before he woke up. He was sitting on his bunk when I approached him, his eyes going to the lemonade before looking at me distrustfully. "Just a little peace offering," I told him, holding up a matching can that I'd gotten for myself. "I know I've been a real horse's ass lately, and just want to apologize and hopefully make friends again." He brightened up a little, smiling as he reached for the can. "I'm glad you finally decided to forgive me," he said happily. "I didn't want to cut you off, but you were trying to break the rules, and the rules are important." He smiled brilliantly as he took that first sip, and I felt like a heel as I smiled back at him. I felt worse with every sip to come, but that little junkie voice in the back of my mind kept gibbering that soon it would be our turn to travel, and we couldn't wait. When he coughed the first time, I didn't think anything of it. He drunk the lemonade a little too quickly and had gone down the wrong pipe. He took another sip to clear it out, but clutched at his throat as he tried to clear it. "Must be an old batch. Feels like there's pulp in it." But he didn't say anything after that. He never said anything again, in fact, as his throat closed and he started to choke. The drink spilled from his hand as he fell back on his bunk. I went to him, his eyes asking me why this was happening. He was scared, his breath whistling out through a pinhole in his closing windpipe. I would later discover that he was allergic to the drugs I had given him. Deathly, so it would appear, but I hadn't known that. I just wanted him to go to sleep, wanted him to pass out so I could rob him, I thought. No need to sugarcoat it. I had intended to steal from him, but I hadn't wanted this. The guards were coming in, telling us to back up, and as I slipped my hand into his breast pocket and took out the chalk, his eyes told me he knew my crime. With his dying breath, he knew I had done this, and now he knew why. He would be dead within a few minutes, CPR and epi shots or not, and as the guards worked on him, I took my chance. I snuck to the back of the dorm like a thief in the night and pulled the blanket up as I put the chalk to the wall. It slid over the surface, and I expected to see the glow, but as the circle was completed, I was staring at nothing but a blank wall. I erased it and drew it again. Nothing. A third circle, but still nothing. I yelled and slammed the chalk against the wall, the instrument disintegrating like a magic trick. They never heard me from behind the blanket, and as I lay on the bare metal and felt the tears coming, I knew what I had done. I'm sitting in confinement now, waiting for their investigation to prove that I killed Davis. I turned myself in because Davis was right. When you do something wrong, especially something that God might not be able to forgive you for, you gotta take responsibility. I realize now, looking at the chalk dust all over my hands, that there was never anything special about it. The chalk was just that, and probably something old and left behind by another forgotten tenant of Stragview. I had been so focused on the object that I had never assumed that the real treasure was the man holding it. The power had been in Davis all along, and I'd killed one of God's miracles for nothing but selfish want. I imagine I'll be here a lot longer than a decade now. I deserve to be here longer than that for what I did to the only real friend I've ever had.
Dude, that's so nasty. Peterson, Waldo to his friends, let the ant crawl across his tongue for a few seconds as the rest of us watched. When he swallowed it down, he ran his tongue out again to show us that it was gone, grinning as we made noises of repulsion. I've been a resident of Stragview Prison for the last 3 years, and I'll continue to be a resident for another year and a half at the least. A couple caught me in their house one night, and after shoving past the guy to get out, I guess he hit his head on the way down. I got 8 years for assault and burglary, and on my first day, I met Waldo. They call him Waldo because of the thick glasses and the striped hat he always wears. I couldn't tell you where he got it. I've never seen anything like it at the commissary, at least. Most people believe he made it himself, and I'm prone to agree. He used to work in laundry, emphasis on used to, and I've certainly seen weirder clothing items come out of that place. No one took it from him, not even the admins, and the name Waldo seems to have stuck. Waldo was known for 2 things on the compound: his hat and eating unusual things. Waldo was in prison for assault, but his talent was his cast iron stomach. When he introduced himself to me, he was eating something out of a Tupperware and smiling hugely. I shook his hand and told him my name, only then to realize that the bowl was crawling with crickets. He was eating them by the handful, scarfing them down with loud crunches, and he laughed as he noticed me noticing the bugs. Grounds crew's been catching them for me for a week now. Gave me $20 of canteen to eat the whole bowl, and that's just more food for Waldo. Waldo was an exhibitionist, pure and simple. People paid him money to eat things, usually bugs or old food, and Waldo ate them down without complaint. Moldy bananas? No problem. Cockroaches? By the fistful. Waldo would eat anything, and it didn't always have to be edible things either. He would eat batteries, a pack of double A's at a time, and he would eat sand right off the rec yard. Nothing seemed to make him sick or slow him down. We all just watched in awe as he ate anything that would stand still long enough. That was until he found the ants. "What do you reckon they are?" I asked. The hill had cropped up seemingly overnight, a giant mound of red clay and fine sand, and it looked like nothing so much as a termite hill in a National Geographic magazine. Faust reached out with his stump, then growled as he traded it for the hand with some fingers on it. He was still getting used to only having one hand, even after several months. I grabbed his wrist before he could touch it, and he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and agitation. Can't have you losing the other one, Faust," I said, trying to postpone his rage. Faust was a cool dude, but he was quick to anger. "Yeah, well, they don't look like they eat much." In that, he was wrong. The ants were just as strange as the hill they inhabited. Each of the crawling things was the size of my thumb, veins of purple worming through their deep red exoskeleton. They had pincers on their heads, long wiggling antennae, and 12 scuttling legs that took them quickly across the hill. They were carrying all sorts of things, food, other insects, and I found myself wondering if they could be a threat. How much would those pincers hurt if they got a hold of you? "What you looking at?" I jumped as Waldo came up behind us, Faust and I looking around like we'd been caught doing something wrong. His eyes got big as he saw what lay behind us, and he made an impressed sound as he looked at the hill with the roaming insects. He had clearly never seen anything like them before, and they thrilled him as only something unknown can. As Faust watched him, I could see an idea beginning to form, and I was not fond of the look. "How much?" Faust asked suddenly. "How much for what?" Waldo asked, looking back at him confused. "How much to eat one?" Waldo looked back at the ants, thinking it over, before settling on a price. $20 a canteen, and I'll eat it right now." Faust groaned. "Man, 20 bones? That's pricey." Waldo had caught one of the ants between his fat fingers, and he was lifting it up for a better look. The ant wriggled furiously, trying to escape as it clacked those monstrous jaws.
Waldo was being careful not to put his finger too close to the pinchers, but the way the ant was thrashing, it would get him eventually. "Going once," Waldo said. "What about 10? I can do 10, Faust hedged. "Nope, gotta be 20, Waldo said, moving his hand back towards the hill. "Going twice." I'll put up 10, I said, not really sure why I had said it. That seemed to be what he was waiting to hear, and he threw the ant into his mouth and bit down with a loud crunch. Sold. He chewed the ant, his face becoming almost rapturous the longer he chewed it. He looked like someone eating a sweet for the first time, someone taking a bite of a favorite meal, and he turned back to look at the hill with real desire. I could swear there was drool sliding out of the corners of his mouth as he watched them scuttle around, his hands shaking a little as he reached towards the hill. "Whoa, man," Faust said. "You win, You ate one. Don't get crazy." Waldo either didn't hear him or didn't care. He was suddenly picking up ants like they were berries on a bush. He was popping them into his mouth, one after another, snapping them off the hill as quick as he could with his deft hands. A thick orange juice was running down his chin, the crunching sounding like poppers, the ones we sometimes threw as kids on 4th of July. And when I stepped up beside him, he turned and glowered at me like a dog with a bone. "Waldo, you got him, man. No need to," but he smacked my hand away when I tried to touch his shoulder. He bent over the anthill and started gobbling them down. He pushed them into his mouth by the handful, his throat bulging as they slid greedily into him. Soon he was pulling handfuls of dirt off the mound, the dirt streaking down his face like a kid eating chocolate pudding. When he pushed the mound over, the mud and dirt structure fell easily. I saw the ants come swarming out. They moved over his arms, mixing easily with the coarse hair that lay there. If they bit him, I never saw him wince, and I could only imagine that his throat was being nipped as he swallowed them. "What in the hell is going on over here?" came a voice from behind us. Faust and I turned to see Officer Grange and his big hairy fingers in the loops of his duty belt, the leather creaking as his gut pushed against it. Grange was a big guy, almost 6.5 feet, and his belly grew a little bigger every year he remained in DOC. He was what the inmates called a beater, a guard who would lay hands on you even if you didn't have to, but his face was more curious than angry today. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, and the sight made him more concerned than angry. Waldo hadn't even noticed him. His eyes goggled, the orbs swimming with tears as he found what he was looking for. The queen ant was the size of a small mouse. Her body was a deep green, her eyes a swirl of fluorescent neon as she inclined her head up to look at Waldo. Grange told us to stop him, but before we could even reach for him, Waldo had taken the fat little matriarch between his thumb and forefinger. His hands shook as he lifted her to eye level, the two sharing a long stare before he popped her into his mouth. He fought us as we pulled him off the hill, but his face was awash with ecstatic joy. I'd seen one of my nephews eat fudge cooked by my mom once, and his face had looked just that way. The perfect mixture of joyous completion and the despair of knowing that you will never find anything like it ever again. Grange yelled for us to get him back to the dorm, and it wasn't till we got out of the rec yard that Waldo stopped shaking. He still looked off, twin brown streaks marking the corners of his mouth, discarded legs clinging to his lips, and when we got him back to the dorm and set him on his bunk, he just stared ahead like he didn't know he was still on the world. Faust returned with a small pile of noodles and snack cakes, and he dumped them onto Waldo's bed. That's when I remembered that I still owed him my half of the deal. I came back with a bunch of commissary and added them to the collection of foodstuffs. Normally, Waldo would have scooped it all up and pushed it into a locker before the leeches in the dorm could come around to beg for food, but he just let it sit there as he stared at the wall. He was acting weird, not at all like his usual self, and the longer Faust and I sat there, the more it started to worry us. Finally, after a few hours of trying to engage him in activities or conversation, we both just left to go about our business. When I went to get a shower later, I saw that he hadn't moved an inch the whole afternoon. He was still just sitting there, staring at the wall, the dried dirt starting to look like blood in the hazy fluorescence as it coursed down his face. I came out of the shower when the guards started yelling about count time, and I saw that Waldo was laying on his side. He was coughing, silent hacks that racked his body. He had the covers pulled up, shivering hard enough to make the bed frame rattle, and I watched him out of the corner of my eye as I got dressed. When he didn't sit up for count, I knew that something was wrong. Officer Darrow blew his whistle then, and I saw him coming out of the station with a roster in his gloved hand. "All right, get your IDs out and sit up for count." He had taken only a few steps when his keen eyes fixated on the prone form of Waldo. He didn't go right for him. That would have seemed too personal and would have made him look like he was looking for trouble. Instead, he made his way along, checking IDs and checking off names until he finally came to the bunk he wanted. He stood at the foot of the bed and tapped his foot against the leg of the bed. "Wargree, inmate Wargree, sit up for count and present your ID." He appeared calm, but Waldo wouldn't be the first inmate that Darrow had put his hands on or that he'd pushed out of bed. Darrow was always spoiling for a fight. It was why they wouldn't let him work confinement anymore, and he had been forced to find his sport elsewhere. He'd been put in E-dorm because they felt that he couldn't stir up too much trouble in here, but whoever had decided that was a fool. Darrow stirred up trouble wherever he was. It was in his nature. Waldo continued to shiver beneath his blankets, ignoring Darrow for all intents and purposes. Darrow smiled, but it was like a wolf smiling at a lamb. "Last chance, Wargree. Sit up and present your ID, or shit's about to get real bad for you." Waldo coughed, and it sounded like a handful of gravel hitting the ground. I tried to look, but I couldn't see what exactly he had coughed up. Whatever it was, it had escaped Darrow's notice. He was looking forward to a fight, and he didn't care who it was with. He pulled back the covers, and I could see that Waldo was still wearing the same dusty prison clothes he'd had on in the yard. He'd just laid over, it seemed, and he didn't even realize that Darrow was talking to him. When Darrow reached down and took him by the shoulders, he lifted him up into a sitting position. Waldo looked dazed as he blinked his eyes at the guard. "You deaf, Wargree? It's count time, and I know that you—" His voice was harsh, but it turned into a disgusted yelp as Waldo vomited up a cluster of squirming ants on him. They were the same ones he'd been eating, and as they came up from his guts, they sank their pincers into Darrow's arm. Darrow shouted as he swiped at him, trying to clear them off him, but his efforts were useless. For every one he knocked off, about 5 more clamped down and dangled from his skin like tumors. Darrow reeled back from Waldo, screaming as the ants bit him. His radio crackled as someone from the booth noticed him. I heard emergency traffic being called and rushed over to Waldo to see if I could help him. Waldo was leaning against his bunk across from him. The ants were coming out of him in a red cluster now. They looked like blood as they hit the floor, thick clots of pulsating red that slid up his leg and back towards his mouth, even as he vomited them onto the floor. I took him by the shoulders and turned him to look at me, and it took everything I had not to drop him again. His front was covered in ants, a squirming line of them already crawling up and back into his mouth. His face had this dumb look of surprise on it, but when his eyes met mine, I stumbled away and fell back over the bunk. My ass hit the floor then, and I scrambled away as I tried to get away from this ant terror. His eyes had become the same multi-spectrum segments the Queen's had been, and I pushed myself under the nearest bunk as I tried to escape him. When the other guards came through the door, they forced him to the ground in a storm of bodies, and it was almost a mercy not to have to look at him anymore. At least, until they all started screaming. Waldo emerged from the stack on all fours, as 4 guards slapped at themselves and rolled away from him. Waldo was more ant than human now, and those odd eyes were the only thing visible amidst the squirming mass of bugs that covered him. He was little more than a writhing mass of red flesh, small oceans with their own tidal poles as they boiled over his body. I watched as his hat emerged from the top, and it was the only real way to still identify him. One of the guards tried to gas Waldo, his can jittering as the ants snapped at him, and they parted as the chemical arced across him. I could see a swath of red flesh beneath before they closed ranks again. Waldo was gone, it seemed, and whether he was controlling the ants or they were controlling him, it didn't really matter anymore. They were one creature, and their symbiosis seemed permanent. At least, until Captain Hulk and his security detail came through the door. That was when Sergeant Moore hit Waldo with his taser. The 3-person group stood stunned by what they were seeing, and Moore's shot was likely just panic fire. The prongs hit Waldo square in the chest, the electricity sizzling up the lines as it made the ant flesh crackle and dance. Something screamed from deep within the ant mound, and I realized that Waldo was still under there somewhere. As Moore kept squeezing the trigger, Sergeant Dace drew his own taser and shot the mound of ants as well. The combined streams made the creature buck and waver, and when the ants fell off of him, it was like hail hitting the ground. Waldo fell amongst them, crushing most of them, and lay twitching as the captain and his sergeants moved in to assess the damage. It was a real shit show, but they managed to get it all covered up. The guards who had been hurt ended up going to the hospital. Many of them had been bit over 50% of their bodies, and I heard a couple of them almost died. I never saw Waldo again after that night. They took him out in cuffs, but it looked like they were heading to the rec field rather than medical. I remember seeing Waldo look back at me, his weird segmented eyes staring sadly back at the faces clustered against the windows, and I wondered if it might not have been kinder to just let him die. I never saw another one of those weird anthills either, but the rec yard was closed for 2 weeks after that while they tore up the grass and dumped pesticide by the truckload. Stragview, I've come to learn over the years, has a lot of strange stories like this one. From the rats to the ghosts to the strange creatures that inhabit the shadows of this place, Stragview is a place outside of time and space. I only have a year left in this place, and I pray I'll be allowed to leave. I wonder if anyone is truly allowed to leave Stragview once it's got its claws into them. They tell you when you start to prepare yourself to work for 12 hours. Most of us had come from jobs where we worked 8-hour days, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I had been an office drone when I found this job in the paper, and it had been an easy choice to switch to a job that would nearly double my take-home pay. I had accrued my share of debt in college, and my student loans were high enough to keep me under the company's thumb until I retired. With the level of pay I was receiving from the prison, however, I could afford to be out of debt in a decade instead of 30 years. Stragview Prison seemed like an escape in those days. In onboarding, they caution you about many things. The inmates, the stress, the workload, and the long hours are always the main bullet points in any presentation. They tell you that you will likely work the night shift for the first 2 years of employment. As a male, they told me that I would probably have to work in the close management dorm, the cell blocks with the rolling doors and the bars on the windows. They told me I would be placed in confinement as a permanent floor officer, where I would have insults and excrement flung at me in equal amounts. They warned us, the fresh-faced TAs who had yet to set foot on the holy ground that was the compound, that we would see things here that we wouldn't see anywhere else. We would be assaulted with ideas and actions that had no place in the outside world. They told us that normal people would look at us and scratch their heads when we tried to tell them that the things they saw on TV weren't the way things actually were. They told us to prepare to be unable to relate to the people who had once been our friends and draw close to the new friends we made while we were on the compound. Above all, they warned us about the strain of our newfound careers. They warned us about the mental stress of day sleeping, sleep deprivation, the long nights that never end. They told us that we would feel the urge to sleep, that we might even find our focus slipping, but that we had to be diligent. We had to be watchful. They told us that we could never take our eyes off them, even for a second, or they would bite like a bad dog. They had selected 2 instructors from the compound for us to learn from. One was a plucky sergeant who worked the religious dorm. I think her name was Dotson. She talked a lot about reform and about inmates turning over new leaves and how it was up to us to provide positive influence, so they knew that there was something outside those walls. The other was a grizzled old warhorse who looked as though he had been carved from the abandoned rock quarry that sat at the edge of the compound. He was tall and gray and seemed uncomfortable in the daylight. He was the one who would tell us, with wide eyes possessed of that 1,000-yard stare, that we must be vigilant and that we must be prepared. He told us about the shifts that last for days. He talked about the shifts that last your whole life. I didn't understand what he meant until that day, until I found my own never-ending 12-hour shift. What happened was a freak accident, which means it had been meticulously planned for weeks. The H-dorm inmates had likely been planning the event, but what happened before it was a perfect shitstorm. We had been experiencing a very aggressive sickness that put most of the dorms in quarantine. The dorms that were not infected were being used to cook the meals, do the laundry, and go about the other day-to-day activities that needed volunteers. These men, of course, had never been trained to do a lot of these things, so as the food quality decreased and the number of inmates on quarantine increased, an underlying panic seemed to permeate the compound. I'm writing this down so someone will remember it later. I'm writing it down so I might remember it later. If there is a later, I guess. Hour 1. When we were called to Quad 4 of H-Dorm, it was to break up a fight. H-Dorm was not under quarantine, but the dorm was a melting pot of different gangs, and they were all afraid of the sick people. The fight was already done by the time we arrived, the parties involved having melted into the crowd. We were left to find them, make sure they received the medical attention they needed, and were adequately punished for disrupting the normal flow of the compound. I was accompanied by 2 other officers, each more useless than the last. Officer Fest was a captain's pet, a bootlicking ladder climber who was better at taking naps than being an officer. He was joined by Sergeant Creast, a year-and-a-day man who was more experienced at smoking cigarettes outside the captain's office than running a dorm. When I had been called for assistance, the captain had found them hanging out by his door and directed them to help me. Together, they might have been a complete officer, but just barely. I didn't much care. This was my dorm, and I was gonna have control. The other officers were purely for appearance. I had a reputation for being fair but firm with my dorm, and that level of consistency goes a long way with these guys. I would have walked out onto the floor by myself any other day and gained immediate control of the situation with a few words and command presence. This was a situation that called for more presence than just me, though. So, the 3 of us left the officer station and went out to put them in their cells and assess the damage. When we arrived, it was clear that the fight was not as over as I had thought. The large group was gathered around a single man. His nose was bloody, and he seemed to be backing himself up against the door of the quad. When we came in, he nearly leapt out into the sally port to get away from the mob. Creast pulled him out, slapping some cuffs on him, and took him away before he could do more than sputter. Fest moved in behind me, popping the seal on his gas as he came to the door. I put out a hand trying to waylay him, but it was already too late. As the group came towards us, I could see the knives coming out, and knew that words were not going to cut it with this bunch. The mob was howling about the man being a carrier, someone with the sickness, and wanted him dead. I reached for my gas, but I was a little too late. The knife slipped into my guts, and I was overcome with the most intense pain of my life. I grabbed my stomach and stumbled back, the mob spilling out the door behind me. They had no real interest in me. They wanted the man that had started the problem. As I leaned up against the glass, I could hear the sirens going off as Hazard, the officer I'd left in the station, saw the carnage and hit the lockdown alarm. My radio exploded with sound, the clarion call of 1024, officer down in Quad 4 of H-Dorm. I saw the mob as it rolled over poor Fest, the orange spray flying indiscriminately as their knives twinkled in slashing arcs. They would soon hit the door and realize that they were locked in, which would make them very angry. That's when they would finally notice poor wounded me and come looking for keys. In the chaos, I scooted on my butt across the slippery floor. I tried to stand, but my knees were kind of shaky, so I made for an empty cell near the mop closet. I shuffled, my guts a mess of angry snakes, as the men at the back of the mob began to divert and come after me. I dug at my gas with my free hand, sending out an orange stream at the ones who had wandered too close. They stepped back, hissing their displeasure as they gripped their faces and rubbed their eyes, and I stumbled into the cell and slammed the door in their face before they could recover. The slamming door was like a coffin lid slamming shut. This cell would be my shelter for the next 12 hours. This cell would be my hell for the next 12 hours. Hour 2. The sun started to set. I could see it through the grates and the plexiglass that hung over the window. It was filmy, like something seen through water. The strange, undulating waves made the common enough setting of the sun look like a painting in some stoner's gallery. It was as beautiful as it was jarring, and I both hoped for the darkness and feared it. The inmates pressed their faces against the smeary glass and leered at me. They reached their hands through the food flap, but they couldn't get me. I was sprawled against the far wall, my back against the warm stone, and I could see the pool of my own blood that had formed beside me. It hadn't looked too bad, a small puncture in my stomach, but the blood kept flowing as I lay there and held it. I removed my uniform shirt, already stained with dark red, and wrapped it around my stomach like a bandage. I'm not a very big guy. The cheeseburgers haven't quite caught up with me yet, and the shirt made a passable bandage. It stopped the bleeding, for now, but I can still see the blood spreading across the fabric. I'm too much of a coward to inspect the wound, and I don't want to make it worse than it already is. I could hear them outside the door. They're bustling like ants, ever plotting as they make their way and their plans. Every now and again, one of them would look in on me. They would press their face to the glass like a kid at the zoo before losing interest and wandering off again. I watched them back, trying to make note of who came to gawk at me. I would have them then. No more Mr. Nice Guy. I'd see them all on the same block as the guy who stabbed me. My radio crackles frequently. They assembled the response team and prepared to breach the dorm. They were having trouble because after H dorm, another had decided to descend into chaos. I had seen them outside the window, decked out in their riot gear, weapons at the ready when the radio reported F dorm was experiencing similar problems. Then D dorm had followed, their inmates not making it out but trashing the place instead. That's when I saw a bleary line of bodies coming out of F dorm as someone disengaged the locks on their doors. I watched as the team was moving to center gate so they could keep the rioters from breaching the inner ward or getting into the administration area that lay beyond. As they ran for the gate, Control crackled over the walkie to ask if I was 10-4. "Yeah, everything's still 10-4, I returned. "Stay safe, we'll get you out of there." They were right, but their rescue plans were a bit premature. Hour 3. I sat in the dying light and contemplated many things. When we put men in these little cells, we never appreciate how their whole world shrinks. These 4 walls became the borders of my world, and I knew that I was trapped here indefinitely, unless some outside force acted on that door. In my case, this was a good thing. The inmates on the outside would tear me to shreds for the keys on my belt. However, this was likely a very sobering thought for a man lying in this bed at night. He could die in this bed, and no one would notice until morning. You could be locked in here with a dead man till morning, and someone may or may not believe you until they saw the corpse. They kept coming by to gawk at me. In the shadows of the cell, I could see their stretched faces as they wavered behind the glass. I could see their lumpy faces in otherworldly dimensions as they blocked out the light to have a look at me. I was as curious as most of them, but a few of them seemed concerned that I might die. They knew that if I died, they'd be blamed. They knew that if I died, it would add to the time on their sentences. Some of them may even care about my life. It doesn't matter why they come, but they all come to have a peek as they pass their lives in this lockdown. As the time crept closer to 9, a fact I only knew because of the chapel bells that tolled every hour until 10, I began to hear some definite agitation from the world outside. Whoever was in the bubble had turned off the TVs. This may seem like a minor enough inconvenience, but to the inmates, the TV was their only exposure to the world. For many, it was their only joy in life, and the absence of it was very upsetting. To top it off, the unnamed officer had also cut the exhaust fans and the wall-mounted fans. The quad in our old prison was not air-conditioned, something the warden had been fighting to maintain for decades. Without the fan to push air and the exhaust fans to pull the hot air out, it would soon become stifling on the wing. Outside, I could hear the sounds of men yelling, things being thrown, and the sounds of their hellish revelry. I wondered briefly how many other officers were in a similar situation. How many were trapped in a cell, trapped in their officer station, their worlds confined to a box now. For inmates, this may seem normal by now, but to me, a man accustomed to moving about the wide world, it was torture. The men out on the yard, men who were now seeing their worlds grow larger by the minute, were freer now than I. The realization made me feel even more claustrophobic than before. The radio only seemed to make my anxiety worse. The mob had taken over the yard and was now trying to break into one of the quarantine dorms. The special response team was on the scene, but the riot quickly spilled out of control. I could hear gunfire out there and knew there would be a few empty beds come morning. That would be on both sides, I had no doubt. Once they started rioting, it was hard to get them to stop. A few could be put down earlier on, but once the rioters had gotten this far, it would be hard to quiet them with that extreme violence. The radio was silent on my end, no one asking for an update on my situation. I told them all I was 10-4 just so they didn't forget about me, but the growing red stain on my shirt made me think otherwise. Hour 4. As the bell in the chapel told 9, the negotiator approached the flap. I was surprised that it had taken him this long to seek me out. In every situation like this, there's always one person who believes they can talk someone out of their stance. Maybe it's a hostage negotiator, a kidnapper trying to keep his charges quiet, an unwilling participant who thinks they can talk their captor out of this foolish act. There's always one person who thinks they can change the situation with a few well-placed words. A few times, I've been that person, the designated talker who tries to de-escalate the situation. When he smiled at me through the glass, I knew why he was there. "We got off on the wrong foot, Sarge. Can we talk?" I was leaning against the wall, head pounding as my wound ached. I turned my sweat-soaked face to him and saw some of his resolve slip. I must have looked a fright. Untreated stab wounds don't tend to make you look fresh, though. "You want these keys," I rasped, getting straight to the point. He nodded, trying to reset his face as he got a good look at me. "There's no way in hell I'm going to give you these keys. You might as well save your breath. And mine." He shook his head like a father who's disappointed with a stubborn child. "Be reasonable, Sarge. There's no one up in the station anymore. You've been abandoned, just like us. We might as well help each other out." Thought about it for a minute. Other than the team assembled and moving, I'd seen no attempts to rescue me. My bleeding wasn't getting any worse, but it wasn't getting any better either. Without medical attention, I wasn't going to last long. I was also without food or water in here. I had nothing besides the water in the sink, or the toilet, and who knew what kind of infection I was putting myself at risk to as I lay on the floor and bled from an unbandaged wound. If I could get out of here, I could use my keys in the medical room at the end of the hall and clean and bandage my wound. If I could get out of here, I could surely find a way to the relative safety of the officer station. Maybe it would be best to make a deal. As though to disprove his words, the lights in the cells came on. The harsh fluorescence made me squint as they popped to life, but I smiled despite the discomfort. Those lights had to be turned on by a person. That meant that there was still someone in the station. The negotiator seemed to realize this too, as I grinned my grisly grin in the face of his obvious defeat. "Go back and tell your friends it's not gonna happen. If you all want these keys, you can figure out how to come in and get them." He shook his head, but to his credit, he didn't lose his cool. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sarge," was all he said, before finally leaving me to my throbbing stab wound. Hour 5. My radio began to chirp. That was the sound that meant the battery was getting ready to die. The batteries are supposed to have an 8-hour charge, but realistically, you're lucky to get 3 or 4 in before you need to change it. The beeps mean that, with limited use, you had about an hour of battery left. As I lay on the floor in pain, I felt like the little radio might be chirping my life away. It had chosen the perfect time to die, too. The riot was not going well for the prison staff. They were holding Center Gate, but there were likely more inmates than ammunition. I could hear other officers on the radio that were trapped in their stations, trying to figure out what was going on. The inmates of Stragview had taken the inner ward. I didn't need the radio to see that one of the dorms was on fire. One of the dorms on the quarantine had been set ablaze, and with no one to put it out, it was unlikely that the inmates inside would survive. I hoped G-dorm was still secure. G-dorm held the inmates who had been talking the loudest about hurting the quarantine inmates. They had found themselves locked up for the last few weeks for attempting to incite a riot, but it appeared that the riot had come off anyway. If they were allowed to escape confinement, it could get a whole lot worse. The sounds of gunfire were few and far between, and as the riot began to settle in, I started getting sleepy. I know that sounds strange, but as I sat on the dirty floor of that cell, I was getting tired. I lifted a hand, the motion stiff and painful, and slapped my face as hard as I could. I'd lost too much blood to fall asleep. If I fell asleep, I might never wake up again. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. My tongue stuck to the roof of it. I dragged myself gingerly over to the sink and depressed the silver button that made the water spray out. It arced into the bowl, and I held my hands out eagerly for it. It was cold against my warm skin, and I sloshed it into my mouth eagerly. I collapsed against the floor then, panting. The act of shimmying across the floor and taking a drink had taken a toll on me. I splashed some of the cold water on my face, trying to wake myself up and also trying to quell the heat that had recently sprung up in me. I was sick, feeling the first pangs of infection, but there was nothing to be done for it. The radio crackled to life suddenly, the operator calling out to me for an update. I reached for the radio, my fingertips slapping it dumbly as I slid it over the floor. I caught it before it fell and pulled it to my mouth with an uneasy hand. The radio felt like it weighed about 30 pounds, and when I depressed the button, I thought it might slip out of my hands for a minute. I told Control that I copied and started to tell them that I was fine, but never got the chance. The radio beeped loudly, and the face went blank. I dropped it to the concrete, the box now useless. It was dead. Hour 6. It was getting hard to stay awake. My guts felt like I needed to crap, but all that came out was a lot of foul-smelling air. My vision was getting fuzzy. I've been here for 6 hours, and I only know that little fact because the inmates yelled at another inmate that it was 11 o'clock, so he needed to shut the hell up. I'm still leaning against the wall, arms propped on the toilet, cheeks pressed against the cold steel of the sink. I think my wound may have reopened when I drugged myself over here. I can see it starting to stain the shirt again, the red growing and soaking into the gray as it spreads my lifeblood across the fabric. These notes may be my final statement to the world. I don't believe they have forgotten about me. I believe I may be less of a priority to them than other objectives, though. I can hear scattered gunfire outside, but it doesn't seem to be coming any closer. Someone is shouting through a megaphone, but I can barely make it out. The way the echoes bounce things around in here, it's a wonder anyone can hear anything. As I sit here writing, I'm looking at the wall across from me, and I think my fever might be getting higher than I thought it was. The concrete wall, a wall I know to be solid, keeps rolling like waves on the ocean. I could almost believe that if I were to stick my hand out, I would feel the waves as they roll along. The effect of watching the wall roll like a high tide is dizzying. I wonder if this is why inmates in confinement always seem so squirrely. Do they see this kind of thing so often that they eventually start to believe it's true? I know that the wall is solid, but at the same time, I know what I can see with my own eyes. Am I going crazy? Or is this just the fever? I can't really be sure. Hour 7. I'm lying on the cold concrete floor, watching the most interesting spider. He's built his web under the bed and has somehow avoided getting it destroyed. I see him watching me as I watch him. We seem to be as interested in each other as the other is. Cold concrete feels good on my hot face, and as I write this, I can feel my hands getting heavier and heavier. I can see someone pointing at me through the window. They're talking to someone else, but I can't hear them over the pounding in my ears. I can't remember if that's normal or not. It feels like I've been back here for days. This notebook tells me it's only been 7 hours, but feels like a lot longer. As I'm writing this, a roach has blundered his way into the spider's web. Mr. Spider has begun the process of eating his dinner, and I watch the shiny brown body disappearing into the white coat. The roach struggles against the inevitable, but as he disappears into his new cell, he gets still. Will I grow still too at the end, I wonder? It's quieting down out there. Most of them are going to bed. I can hear them closing their cell doors and settling in. Smart ones are closing their doors, at least. Leaving your door open is a great way to get shot when the National Guard finally gets here. Going to bed sounds like a great idea, actually. I know I shouldn't, but I can barely keep hour, ? I don't know what time it is. The ceiling is spinning like a top as I lay here and look at it. I don't know why I'm still writing. My hand moves on its own, it seems. I feel like I'm floating. My stomach throbs in time with my heartbeat. Something is going on outside. I can hear people yelling. Their voices sound so stupid and fragile. They sound like toy soldiers stuck in the mud. The ceiling keeps changing colors as it swirls. It looks like a blacklight poster I saw once in my friend's room. It shifts through the colors as the spiral continues to spin. I can see a light starting to form in the middle of it. I wipe sweat off my forehead. I can feel the flesh against the back of my hand, and I don't like it. It's much too warm. Things are making banging noises outside the window. I can hear boots stomping around inside and outside. People are shouting. I don't know what's going on. I'm scared. I want to go home. Hour 10. I wake up to the sound of banging on my door and chimes from the tower signaling chow time. I managed to sit up and make my eyes focus long enough to see that it was the negotiator from earlier. He doesn't look so sure of himself now. There's a big bruise on his cheek, and he looks pretty scared. He keeps swimming in and out of focus, but I don't think that's anything he's doing on purpose. "Sarge," he yells, trying to get my attention. "We need to get out of here. Please give us the keys, and we'll get you some help." I can't muster the focus to speak to him. I manage to flop back to my spot between the toilet and the sink and run some water into my hand. The cool water feels nice, but it's doing nothing to cool me off. I can feel myself sliding sideways again, but the guy yells at me and forces me to come back to some kind of groggy reality. "Sarge, please, you're not going to last much longer. You're the only bargaining chip we have left. Please, we can get you out of here. We can get you some help." I lean against the wall again, blocking him out. I'm not even sure how I'm still writing at this point. I'm tired. I think I'll stop for a while. Hour 11. Someone's out there rolling doors open. I can hear them loud as thunder as they crash open in their metal tracks. People are yelling, but it's all very strange. I'm having trouble feeling my fingers. My arms feel real heavy. My breathing feels watery and my chest feels kind of thick. I think I might be dying, but that's probably wishful thinking. There's no face at my door, but that doesn't mean anything. Maybe they're figuring out how to get into the booth. Maybe they have keys. Who can know? I can hear someone outside the doors. voices raised in anger, and I'm afraid now that they might have figured out how to get in. The door close to mine just slid open with a sound like a landslide. If they come in here, they'll kill me. That may not be such a bad thing, though. My notebook is lying on my lap, and the writing I can see appearing on the page is nearly illegible. I can see the original pool of blood I left. Hello, pool of blood. It's dark red and flaky, but the red streaks I left earlier are still a little wet looking. I can feel my pants. They're tacky with my blood and sticking to me with my pee. I'm surprised I'm still conscious, honestly. Another door rolls open, the one right next to my cell. I can hear someone next door screaming, and the sound of a gun as it crashes in the quiet dorm. A gun? Did the inmates get their hands on some guns? Why would they start killing each other? That's a stupid question. Why do inmates do anything? Well, if they have a gun, at least it'll be quick. There's a bright light on my face. My door is rolling open. I hope it's quick. Hour 12. That's a lie. It's really been about 3 days, but it might as well have been 12 hours. A lot has happened in those 3 days. The men at the door turned out to be the recovery team. While I was hovering on the edge of life, they breached the quad through the fire door and rolled in on the disoriented inmates. I've been told casualties were limited, but I heard someone get shot next door, so who knows? My wound was bad. The knife had pierced something important, and that something had started leaking into my sternum. I had continued bleeding, thanks to the leakage, and the doctor said that if I hadn't been saved, I would likely have died in a few more hours. I had been flushed out, patched up, given antibiotics, and will likely make a full recovery. The warden himself came down to speak with me. He's an odd guy. I had only met him a handful of times, and it's always weird to see him outside the prison. He offered to shake my hand, but I made a half-hearted show of it. He seemed very intent on my story, asking me to recount my experiences for him, as he regarded me with those far too curious eyes. I could swear they gleamed from behind those little glasses he wears, and I told him that I'd lived through it. The prison will, of course, cover my medical bills, and the warden has offered me a commendation for bravery. Bravery. All I did was survive. I didn't tell him about the notes I had. I wanted to keep them so I could see if they matched my memories. The cramped, scrabbly handwriting is just barely legible, and it reads more like the writings of a madman. I'll probably post it along with this story just in case you'd like to read my half-mad ravings. You're probably curious to know why you're reading this at all. The story contains no monsters, no supernatural things, no killers, or anyone other than the guy that tried to stab me, I guess. The story contains a different sort of horror, though. When you're trapped behind the door, your blood running out, you begin to feel that your life is on a stopwatch. It's a sobering feeling, knowing your time is limited. Just because I made it out doesn't mean they all do. So if you decide to go behind the fence, make sure you're ready for whatever those 12 hours have in store for you.